Hi, I'm Jay. I'm Technical Pre-Sales Manager here at Askaris, and thank you for joining us for the Birth of Cybersecurity event here at the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park. First of all, just going to talk a little bit about who we are as a company, our history, before we start on the history of cybersecurity, where it was over the last 80 years, and what is important to us now and moving forward into the future. So Askaris has been going for roughly 23 years, predominantly been a checkpoint security partner for the majority of those years. And in the last 2 years, we have seen a shift in the cybercrime and in the technological world. It's required us to diversify and become a more diverse partner and adopting a defense in depth and solutions-led approach. As I said, we are a 5-star checkpoint partner, which gives us the bread and butter of where we come from and the skill set that we actually have within the industry. And that's just a brief look into Askaris. And what I'm going to talk about today is how, since the 1940s, cybersecurity has started and where it's going to, and through the decades, and where it is at the moment and now, and what we're going to look to as we go through to the future. So starting point was obviously the Enigma, which you'll see and hear a lot about today at Bletchley Park, at the National Museum of Computing. And the reason why it's a good starting point is essentially the first people to break Enigma cipher codes were the first hackers. And you can either look at that in one of two places. You can either look at them from a white hat perspective, because obviously they were helping Britain and the Allied forces in trying to stop attacks. But if you look at it from a Nazi point of view, they were the first black hats. They were the first ones to breach. And the way that they did that was through a combination of mathematics whilst exploiting weaknesses in hardware. And the reason why that is prevalent to now is exactly what happens in today's infrastructure. The first things that attackers are looking at is weakness in hardware and weakness in people. And that's exactly how it all kicked off and where we're seeing it moving forward. And the reason why that was so tough and what made it so unique was there's more ways to set up Enigma than there are atoms in the world, in the known universe. And that's what Nazis were convinced, that it was unbreakable. As most cybersecurity vendors will tell you that their hardware and their infrastructure is unbreakable. Everybody's exactly the same, and they have been since then. And they believed it would take a lifetime to break. And it took somebody like Sir Alan Turing and his team matter of years rather than a lifetime to be able to break that Enigma and start to help the Allied forces. And the reason and how they did that was they approached the problem in a different manner. They adopted new technology and created something different that wasn't ever seen before. And you'll see that with the bomb and the work it took Alan Turing to go through to be able to get that into a working area, to be able to start deciphering the code. But it takes a lot more than that. They had to think about it in a different way and start to analyze people. And that's where we look at user behavior analytics now. They were starting to do that way back in the 1940s when they're trying to analyze what key words were being said on a certain time and a certain day, so that they were able to join up what was being said so they could decipher it in a lot easier. And this is a key point to remember, and it brings us back to reality that even in the 21st century, networks are only as secure as the weakest link. And that hasn't changed in 8 decades. Whether that's unpatched systems, wrong configurations, or even down to the people making mistakes, which you'll learn it was a key factor in breaking Enigma, because they started to become very predictable, and people are predictable, and that's how we kind of break into them. So how cybersecurity changed since the 1940s, through the 1940s until now. So in the 40s, obviously, the first digital computer was built. Obviously, it doesn't look like what it does today. It was just a bunch of wires spitting out a load of different data. And at that point, though, cyber attacks were very tricky. Internet was still decades away, and there was no way for computers to be accessed remotely. And those who did have access to the computers, early adoption of computers, was very, very low in that sense. And it took a very minute amount of people to actually use them because they were so new. And however, at the end of the 40s, we can actually ascertain that in 1949, the first theory of computer viruses was actually brought out by John von Neumann, who speculated that programs will end up being able to reproduce and start moving forward. And he was correct. As we've seen today, we are seeing more sophisticated malware and viruses that are actually self-replicating and can actually go across the network in different ways and learn. Even as we push into the 1950s, computer hacking was still something we haven't seen. Obviously, the internet hasn't been adopted by that time. People are still not adopting the use of computing, and it was still very, very niche in that sense. However, we did see the first telephones sort of hacking being happened, and these were called telephone freaks. So much like freaks with an F, but with a PH, because obviously they were doing telephone freaks. And what they were essentially doing is hijacking protocols that allowed telecom engineers to work on the network remotely, and they were hijacking those to make free calls and to be able to not pay long distance charges. So they weren't doing it in any way, shape or form to be malicious, they were just doing it for their own financial gain. However, this saw how people were adopting different techniques and seeing that technology was rising and how they could exploit those weaknesses for their own gain. And this was where we can start seeing cybercrime becoming a new thing, and everywhere down to the phone. Unfortunately, because at that time, cybersecurity and security as a whole wasn't a known thing. It was very hard to pick up, and telecoms companies couldn't really do anything about it, but fortunately it did die out come the 80s. And the most notable side of this, the freak community, as they were called, were a big thing. They would write newsletters on how they were doing things, and these freak communities actually included Apple founders Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. So they were part of that whole brainchild of becoming phone freaks, and you can see where they are today. And this essentially was where we can see the mold being set for modern day cybersecurity as we moved into the 1960s. The start of the 60s was quite quiet. Computers were huge mainframes. They were sat in massive temperature-controlled rooms with very limited access. And internet was imminent, but it wasn't really there. So again, to be able to access these systems, you had to be on site, you had to know what you were doing. So it's quite quiet in that sense. However, in the mid-60s, there was the early forays of hacking. Students from, I believe it was MIT, started to get involved and start being very curious mischief makers and started to get into these large mainframes and start playing around. And this kind of, IBM saw this and saw these issues with these people playing around and starting to deep dive into these technologies, that in 67, IBM brought in a bunch of high school kids to basically look at one of their first adopted computers to say to them, have fun, go at it, see what you can deep dive into it, see what you can pick up, and then come back to us with how far you got into it. And the reason why that's prevalent is it was a valuable lesson for IBM in testing the technology, testing cybersecurity, making sure that they create better defensive measures. And that's where we started seeing even more cybersecurity becoming a bigger aspect within technology companies in how they're gaining a defensive mindset. And these, if you look at it in that kind of way, these kids in 67, essentially were the first ethical hackers. They were the first ones that were being brought in to have a check on the IBM system softwares and where's the gaps and come out with a report. If you think about that now, we do exactly the same thing. It's just in a remote way. We're looking in and going to find out what we can find in terms of language and configurations. So 67 saw the birth, in my view, as ethical hacking. As we moved into the 1970s, this is where early internet, so ARPANET, so the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network was created in 1972. And this was, as I say, early internet and how researchers were able to send data over multiple different systems instead of having to carry big tapes off to each one as they used to do. And this started with the first hackers or the first issues as a researcher, Bob Thomas, creates the Creeper. And what that did was it was just a self-generated program that moved across the ARPANET, and it left a trail with a message saying, catch me if you can, which was quite funny. But with this, it saw a bit of cat and mouse as Ray Tomlinson, who everyone should know, obviously came up with the email. He bought out Creeper, which actually was there to catch Reaper and to get rid of it. And the one thing with Creeper, as it moved forward, it actually became the first self-replicating program and essentially became the first computer worm. And what essentially Ray Tomlinson did was create the first antivirus in 1970s, in the mid 1970s, and that, as we can see, kind of snowballed on from there, and how cybersecurity is starting to become more prevalent. People are starting to new technologies. They're actually seeing, and it's starting to grow and grow. And we're seeing single problems being dealt with single pieces of technology to be able to combat it. And we see this because it was challenging. The vulnerabilities became more required because companies are starting to use the telephone networks to be able to send data across. And that meant people were starting to have to adopt new technologies and start to think a bit more out of the box on how they're going to combat these issues. And the reason why the governments started seeing this because we knew how catastrophic intercepting data was going to be. Because look at World War II, for example. We combated with Enigma. We stopped a lot of war-based crimes. And we started to see the first hacker, or real-time hacker, in 1979 when 16-year-old Kevin Mitnick, and we can know how annoying kids can be, hacks into the Ark. The Ark essentially was a computer used to develop the operating systems for the computers they were building, and he copied the software. At that point, he was arrested and, of course, tried, but he did go on to come back out of prison and carry on hacking and keep going and going and going. Luckily, today, he stopped that, and he now runs a consulting company of Mitnick Security Consulting out in the US, but it shows how even down to the children and teenagers were the ones that are becoming the biggest problem. And I think we can still see that now in the sense of if we see certain different of attacks, much like the TalkTalk attack was done by a teenager. So we're seeing these kids are starting to become more aware. As we moved into the 80s, this saw the increase in high-profile attacks. For example, AT&T in the beginning of the 80s. But we also saw how the wider audience and the public are starting to see cybersecurity in the sense of films being generated. I don't know if anybody's seen the War Games, in the sense of a rogue computer has basically taken over a missile system and used it, and it thinks it's a game. But it is essentially a cybersecurity issue because it's a self-replicating program that's taking control of something. And with that, and that was in 1983, which simultaneously was the date or the year that the first Trojan horse and computer viruses was first used into computer networks. From there, we saw the Cold War happening, and cyber espionage was started to become more prevalent. And this is where we see the cybersecurity maturity increasing, as in 1985, the US Department of Defense publishes a trusted computer systems evaluation criteria. And that was essentially the start of and the birthplace of compliance within networks. So the US Department was essentially given a set of rule sets and definitions of how a cybersecurity should be adopted within a network. From there, Marcus Hess in '86 was another big attack and a big prevalent one where he's using internet gateways to piggyback into ARPANET. He essentially hacked 400 military computers so that he could sell to the KGB. So even though we're seeing an adoption of better cybersecurity, and cybersecurity is in the minds, it's still obviously not there, and it's not happening until this point. And we also now starting to see that cyber criminals are starting to get ahead of the game and starting to become that one step ahead of everybody else. And this is where we started seeing an increase in learning, and users are starting to quickly learn at this point to monitor command.com's file size, command.com's file sizes. As the increase in file size meant there was more than likely something happening. So at this point, even though we're seeing attackers becoming more and more sophisticated and they're starting to learn of how to get into systems, we're also seeing a very, very steep learning curve for the white hats and those trying to protect their systems and also trying to keep up. And they are starting to learn so that they can mitigate quickly. At that point, obviously, they're understanding it's not a point of trying to stop a breach because, as we all know, it's not going to happen, but they know the quicker they can figure out what's going on, the quicker they can stop something from happening. As we move into the late 80s, the birth of the commercial cybersecurity. So the first commercial AV was brought out by Lunig and Fig, released the AV for the Atari ST. And then later, not long after that, good old John McAfee setting up shop with Intel, as we all know who he is, and releases the first virus scans. And around this time, as we can see that the first AV is kicking off, cyber attackers are starting to learn even more that these things are happening. And this is where we're seeing more and more prevalent attacks with the first documented malware. So again, once again, we're seeing a problem's being fixed, a problem's being looked at. However, the attackers are now starting to learn and starting to change their tactics and start to get into a bit more savvy, and brought out the Vienna virus, which basically which then was neutralized by burn fig in the wild. So we're seeing our first 0 days, but we're then seeing, once again, we're seeing everybody else coming out at the back end trying to fix the problem very, very quickly. So as much as they're getting more sophisticated, so are we. From then, 88 onwards into the early 90s, AV companies increases and they started to saturate the market. And as much as these were they were just simple scanners, basically performing context searches and detecting unique code, they were adding immunizers into that system. So when they found a piece of malware or a piece of code that's sequencing, essentially the immobilizer would trick the computer, trick the virus by changing the program to make it think like it's already been hacked and already been breached, and it will stop what it's doing. Unfortunately, again, viruses started to increase, more and more started to saturate as the attackers started to get more and more sophisticated. And unfortunately, with the sheer volume of viruses that were hitting onto the computer networks, the immunizers became obsolete. And this shows the change in tactics that black hats and attackers were essentially utilizing to be able to counteract what we were doing. So moving on to the 90s, as I say, we're moving into a new age and a dawn of new technologies, and with PCs and personal computers starting to come into the foray. And what we're seeing is the first polymorphic viruses, which are basically code mutating viruses, which kept the same original algorithm. So it still did the same piece of work. However, because the code was polymorphic, traditional signature-based AVs weren't picking it up. So we're seeing very, very sophisticated viruses, even into the early 90s, which were causing more and more problems, making traditional signature-based antivirus obsolete very, very quickly. So this is the point where we're understanding now how, even though the technology is taking maybe 30 years to get to a certain point, it's now changing at a more rapid pace, making cybersecurity a bigger issue as we move today. Even down to some of the PC companies, because PC Today in the early 90s released a free disk that accidentally contained disk killer virus, and it basically affected thousands of computers, because obviously they didn't understand cybersecurity, and these polymorphic viruses were basically sent out in a nice little disk and causing absolute mayhem. From there, we saw what we can see the early adoption of cybersecurity being researched in more prevalence. So the European Institute for Computer Antivirus Research, it's an absolute mouthful, was established at this point. And what they were starting to see was early AV was purely signature-based, which what this was creating was a lot of false positives, which meant even though things weren't being attacked, it was still causing havoc for businesses thinking they were being attacked. And this is where, and at the same time, this is where we saw a lot of the virus adopting new techniques, again, keeping ahead of the game with stealth and macrovirus posing new challenges into the mid-90s. And at this point, it became clear that cybersecurity needs to be mass-produced. We needed to up our game. We really needed to be pushing this out. And this is where we see more and more cybersecurity companies starting to build and the new approaches starting to come into it. And even though we were getting to a good place in the mid-90s, we were understanding a lot more. Unfortunately, then emails, by the end of the 90s, email was created in a more commercialized setting, which created even more issues because social engineering started to become a factor that everybody had to think about. So even though they were over here thinking AV, we've got viruses growing over there, they've now got to think of, right, how do we stop it from getting in via email now? And then this was seen in 99 when the Melissa virus was unleashed, and that was via a Word document, which copied itself and becomes the fastest, even now, the fastest spreading virus known to man, because it literally absolutely wreaked havoc and cost $80 million to fix. And if you think into the late 90s, $80 million probably constitutes to a business's revenue stream. So from there, we moved on to the 2000s. So we're getting very close to where we're at today. Internet's becoming available in homes, causing even more threat risk. So what we're seeing at this point is that the global increase in threat footprint was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Not only are we looking at business cybersecurity issues, we're now looking at home-based cybersecurity issues. 2001 is when we saw the use of infected sites. So sending people with a link to a URL which essentially had malicious code embedded, and somebody clicked on that link, went to the site, and bang, they've got a computer virus, creating even more something else that people need to start thinking about. So we're seeing the sophistication growing at an exponential rate very, very quickly, meaning it was very hard for us to start picking this up. And due to this sophistication, if you look at the detection rates in 2006, were around 40 to 50%. By 2007, that had dropped down to 20 to 30%. So they were picking up from nearly half to nearly a fifth of what was going out there in the wild, which was causing even more problems. And this was only going down to the mid 2000s. And the key challenge to this was the fact that traditional AV was starting to become more and more of a problem. It slowed down performance of computers, which caused business risk, but at the same time, because it was, as I keep saying, it was signature-based. And so what they needed to do was create a solution that was more to move towards software to the cloud. And in 2007, Panda Security, which is now WatchGuard, is one of our key vendors here today, combined cloud technology with threat intelligence within their AV product, essentially birthing the first EDR solution that worked on more threat intelligence rather than signatures, creating the new age of next generation antivirus. From then, other programs started to follow suit, so they saw Panda Security doing what they're doing, and we started seeing the birth of other companies, such as McAfee started to bring out their side of things, Sophos, and other key vendors. With that, the noughties did actually give us a good understanding of the fact that we needed to embed cybersecurity in operating systems. So we're starting to encrypt operating systems at point, which created another layer. And for me, this was where we started seeing defense in depth, noticing that we required multiple technologies and multiple tactics and techniques to be able to understand an attacker and what they're doing, and making sure that there's specific key technologies to stop people at certain attacks. And from this, you can probably, I've seen the Lockheed Martin kill chain, which gives a good understanding of how an attacker exploits a network, and that's where we see the defense depth approach started to really take hold, and companies bringing this. As we moved into the 2010s, it's crazy saying that because it's only been a decade away, even though I can still remember what was going on in 2010. We are seeing higher profile breaches happening with prevalent with more sophistication, as a lot of us in the industry know. Oxamar published 400,000 credit card details in 2012 with a hack to a single system, which saw probably one of the biggest the first credit card hacks out there. Edward Snowden, who was part of the CIA, copied and leaked classified government info from NSA back in 2013. And what this saw was one of the first insider threats, and started to give another arm of what people needed to think about. It wasn't just the external threats that we need to look at, it wasn't just social engineering, but it's their people that were another threat and the problem. 2013 to 14, Yahoo was breached. As some of us in the industry will remember, 3 billion users were hacked. But with this, we saw one of the first fines, and one of the biggest fines at that time happening, with a $35 million fine given to Yahoo for not disclosing. So again, we're looking at a lot of the compliance is starting to come into it all, and we're looking at compliance being a big factor when people are trying to adopt cybersecurity tactics. 2017 here in the UK, WannaCry hits, and we see the sophistication that happens. And the reason why that one, for me, is quite prevalent in the sense of how sophisticated things were looking was, it was a slight change in malware, in ransomware code from Eternal Blue, and it was only a slight change to change it into the WannaCry code, and traditional AV didn't pick it up because of that slight change, and it wreaked absolute havoc, locking down the whole NHS systems. 2019, the New Zealand stock market grinds to a halt due to a sophisticated attack on their network, causing massive financial impact to to New Zealand. To New Zealand. So we can see that at this point, the 2010s started to see the next generation of cybersecurity built in. So next generation innovation becomes more required rather than nice to have. So we're looking at our firewalls are starting to bring out new key features instead of it just being an inbound and outbound. What can get in, what can't get in. We're starting to see things like anti-malware, web filtering, another sandboxing, MFA, user behavior analytics, network behavior analytics, threat intelligence, backups offsite. AI started to drive into it. So we're seeing now how quickly we're bringing in brand new technologies. And this, if you look at back into the 90s up to the 10s, you can see how quickly we're adopting even more sophisticated tooling. And it's only taken, in that sense, 10 maybe 20, less than 20 years. So where are we at now? So in the 20s, already we're seeing massive implications into high-profile attacks, and these are starting now with the security companies are starting to get these attacks becoming target, like SolarWinds. SolarWinds being attacked was a massive problem. COVID having a mass effect on how we look at cybersecurity, as security teams started to really be affected with the adoption of cloud infrastructure at an exponential rate, even though it was a kind of a new development concept back in the early 2000s. We're seeing 2020 where they had a 5-year plan. We saw a 500% increase in time or decrease in time it took for a company to adopt cloud, creating even more security problems at that point as business impact was put over cybersecurity impact. So what's to come is unknown, but what we know is everything that we've started from the 1940s still has a prevalent on what we do today. Ethical hacking is still required, and they started that back in 1967. The whole side of looking at insider threats back in the 90s, the first user behavior analytics happening with the bomb, when we created the bomb and how we cracked Enigma. Everything that we've done back then still has prevalence of what we do today. And we need to be mindful of that. And working with key vendors that we've got here today, working with an MSP like Askaris is where we see is the best fit, as that kind of defense in depth approach and monitoring systems on a 24/7 basis is hard for any security team. And at the same time, we understand that obviously money is always going to be tight, so we need working together in a financial, but obviously at the same time, at the end of the day, cybersecurity needs to go above all else, because if you don't have a business, that money in the first place doesn't really matter. Thank you for listening to me today, and I'll be around all day.